Okay. Hello, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm an Alumni Relations Officer at SAIS in Washington, D.C., and I'm here today with Susan Shively, who graduated with a Bologna certificate in 1969 and from SAIS in 1970 in Washington, D.C. And today's date is April 26th, 2013, and we're just going to have a little bit of a conversation. But thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for
calling. Absolutely. And we're in her fabulous office on the 27th floor of a building in the middle of Philadelphia. And so we're happy to have you. And why don't we just start with maybe what originally brought you to SAIS?
Well, I went to Ohio Wesleyan University undergraduate school and spent my junior year in Vienna. It was an American anyway, it was wonderful, fabulous year. I was an economics major and became more interested in international economics, and so that led me to SAIS. And I wanted to go back to Europe because it was wonderful in those days. I mean, you know, for nothing you could get a Eurail pass. I mean, we traveled all the time. It was marvelous.
That's great. That's great.
That's how I got to SAIS.
Mm-hmm. And then tell us, I mean, you mentioned really enjoying Bologna. Tell us a little bit about your experiences on both campuses.
What stands out, I was thinking a bit after your phone call, about Bologna in those days. I think there were 26 American students out of the total. And there was a cafe right on where the classroom building was, Ivano's. And everybody would meet at Ivano's in the morning for coffee, and each nationality would have picked up their own newspaper. So there was German press, the French, British, whatever, and we'd all talk about the same events, and it was fascinating because every report was different. It was really, that's one of the most interesting things to me, actually.
That's great. And do you remember your friends or like maybe world events that were happening at that time, or professors?
When was the Czechoslovakian Revolution? There was some uprising, I think, around that time.
Mm-hmm.
When did Nixon...
72. You got impeached.
Okay, that was medical school. Got mixed up.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I only know that because it was the year I was born.
Oh.
Yeah, but
geez.
yeah, but anyway, but what about professors, or did you have any good classes that you remembered the content, or?
I remember the people more.
Mm-hmm.
We traveled a lot. Dagmar Pfeiffer was a good friend. I've lost touch with her.
Oh, great.
She's German. Actually, I spent Christmas with her family. Anyway, they would say, well, hello, how are you? We didn't know a thing about what went on in the war. It was still recovering. Places were still recovering then. And I lived, four of us roomed together. Olga Gurkovac, I think she still has been active in some SAIS events, or the alumni. There was some sort of reunion at Bologna a couple of years ago, and a whole group of us were phoning. I can't remember the names. Paul Marshall and Sue Mall, and there was a British, I forget her name. Anyway, they were wonderful friendships for that year.
That's great. They do a Bologna reunion every year. In fact, it's this weekend.
Is it?
So everybody talks about it. It's fabulous. So that's great. And then what about when you were in Washington? Do you recall your experiences there?
What I remember most, it was 1970. People were rioting, and along Massachusetts Avenue and DuPont Circle. So I remember one evening, and we lived not far from there. There were police on horses, tear gas, and people yelling, "Pigs, pigs!" It was horrible. That stands out in my mind, frankly, more than the classes.
No, that's life experiences people talk about all the time. That's great. And did you live near the campus? Were you rooming with people in an apartment? A lot of people did that.
Right. I think our apartment was on Massachusetts Avenue, New Hampshire Avenue.
Okay,
So it was
right around the corner.
Right around the corner.
That's
right.
great.
And the same in Bologna, we weren't far away from the center. And they were with 4 Bologna people. 3 of us were American and the British woman whose name I can't remember. And Sue Mal and I were roommates in Washington.
Great. So in that second year, you started to think a little bit about what you wanted to do.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about that process and what your career sort of started out to be and how it evolved.
Well, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought the Foreign Service would be too constricting for me because I tend to talk a lot. And I don't know that I could have followed the appropriate diplomatic protocol if I felt strongly in the opposite direction. So I couldn't do that. And so with very conflicted feelings, I went into this, accepted this banking job. And then realized that women...
What was the banking job?
It was I think it was a management trainee, international banking management trainee program at Marine Midland. You know, I don't remember. I may have been the only woman in the group of 12 or 13. I might have been. I don't think I would have remembered if there were any other. But it seemed to me that women really didn't do anything. We weren't even allowed to wear pantsuits. And anyway, I would have been probably sent to Rome, which didn't seem really challenging in terms of intellectual activity and actual professional accomplishment. Didn't really seem to be what I wanted to do. I also, at the time, married one of my co-trainees, and decided that I really did want to have a career. Women had these questions in those days. Sounds ridiculous now. And so that's how I decided I'd like to go to medical school. So I took the pre-med classes at Columbia and was lucky enough to be accepted to Penn, where I started in 1972.
You were telling us a minute ago about the story of going to NYU. Tell us that story again. That was great.
It was the spring of, would have been the spring of 1971. I walked into the admissions office at the medical school at NYU and said I would like to go to medical school. And the secretary there started laughing, and she said, "Oh, sweetie, you and 20-some thousand other people, I guess you'll have to take some courses." So anyway, Columbia had a post-bac program. I'm sure they still do. Penn has it, Bryn Mawr has it, most places have some sort of program to do the adequate pre-med classes. And actually, there was a fellow in the group, Chris Bourne, who ended up 20 years later. We live in the same apartment building. He's an orthopedic surgeon.
Oh, that's great.
And one day we passed each other in the lobby. There was Chris.
Who you hadn't seen?
No, I hadn't seen him for years.
Oh, wow. That's great.
We moved to Philadelphia when I got accepted at Penn. I think he had to reapply. So I lost touch, and there he was. So it's a very small world.
Yeah, absolutely. So you did 4 years of medical school.
Right.
And then did you do a residency?
I did a residency
in New York
in
or
Philadelphia.
in Philadelphia?
In psychiatry at the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital.
Oh, great.
Which was a long-term psychiatric hospital, like McLean's in Boston. I don't know if you or Shepherd Pratt used to be, but there aren't many of them anymore.
And was that a 2-year residency?
It's 1 year of medical internship with 4 years of 4 months of psychiatry, and then 3 years of psychiatry. So it's a 4-year program, and then I did psychoanalytic training, which is another 6 or 8 years long.
Wow, that's great. The psychoanalytic training was 6 or 8 years.
Right.
Wow, that's great.
Right. I think it was 5 years of coursework, and then you have to complete 3. You have to have your own analysis. It's very long. And then 3 control cases. That means that you're under supervision while you're conducting the analyses. And I think one of them had to graduate. One of them had to terminate before you could graduate. So the whole process is along.
Terrific.
So I, in a way, lost touch with a number of the SAIS people. We knew people in New York. Philip was there. He later died. So did Peter Petrocelli. So that first year when I was working in New York, there were a group of us in New York who stayed in touch. Some others went into the Foreign Service. And recently, George and Carol Kent, we've been in touch with. George and Carol, who were in Bologna and Washington.
That's great.
They're
Yeah.
in,
We tried to call
Westchester.
them. Yeah, we talked about that. That's great. Good. And then, so that went on. So while you were in psychoanalytic training, were you also in this practice, or when did you start? When did you move into this space?
I moved into this space probably, I think, 12, 13 years ago. So I had my office at the, I point there because that's a picture of it.
So I'm gonna point the camera to the picture that which you're referring.
Print. It was called the Insane Asylum in West Philadelphia. Well, the Quakers were involved with, Pennsylvania Hospital was the first hospital in the country, and usually mental patients, people would basically pack them a lunch and say, move on. And Pennsylvania Hospital started keeping people in the basement. They had cells in the basement where they fed them and kept them. And then they bought a farm in West Philadelphia and started horticulture therapy. So the mental patients would, grow flowers and plants. And that was the beginning of the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital. So, yeah, it's amazing. That's great. My office was there for years. And then in the 90s, when hospitals of this ilk were losing insurance funding, there were many changes in healthcare financing then, and this was really after years of the deinstitutionalization of the people who you now see on the street who are homeless. Anyway, a group of us moved from there into the city, and then 13 years ago I moved here. So
that's great, terrific. And do you like what you do?
Love it, absolutely love it.
That's
and first my junior year in Europe, and then the whole SAIS experience, the people, the students, the professor, I mean, just wonderful people. People of such different backgrounds. Everybody was very smart, loved to learn. It was wonderful. I loved it. Loved it.
And sort of along those lines, thinking about current students today, what advice might you have for them? What would you say to them now?
Oh, I think they should, try to follow their dream and do what they really like to do, because they're going to be happier if they're doing something they really like.
That's
than if it's something that they think they should be doing.
Okay.
And especially for the women, I mean, it's a completely different world. It's wonderful.
Many more options.
Oh, yeah.
That's great.
Right.
Well, thanks so much for your time today, and we really appreciate hearing your story.